Now it's my honor to introduce our two guests tonight. Tonight we have Elliot Ackerman, who I had the pleasure of interviewing almost a year ago now. Elliot is both a former White House fellow and Marine who has served 5 tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan, where he received the Silver Star, the Bronze Star for Valor, and the Purple Heart. His books have been nominated for the National Book Award and the Dayton Literacy Peace Prize. Joining Elliot, we have Admiral James Stavridis, who has spent more than 30 years in the US Navy, rising to the rank of 4-star Admiral. He was Supreme Allied Commander at NATO and previously commanded US Southern Command, overseeing military operations in Latin America. He holds a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts, where he recently served also as Dean. He has published many books and hundreds of articles, and is Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst for NBC News and a columnist at both Time Magazine and Bloomberg Opinion. He is currently an operating executive of the Carlyle Group, an international private equity firm, and chair of the Board of Counselors of McLarty Associates, an international consulting firm. Please join me in welcoming my colleague Ronan O'Malley as we present Elliot Ackerman and Admiral James Stavridis. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much. And we're going to get into a discussion of the book itself, but just to open things out, the Admiral and Elliot are going to have a presentation, again, opening the book, and I'll let the two of you take that away, and I'll step back in about 10 minutes.
Wonderful to be with everyone. And the question I get asked a lot is, why did you write a book about a war with China in the future? And the answer is because I looked into the past. I looked at the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. And I realized that a great deal, in my view, of the reason we didn't go to a nuclear war with the Soviet Union was because there was a rich body of Cold War literature, both film and novels, things like Dr. Strangelove, The Third World War by Sir John Hackett, Red Storm Rising by Tom Clancy, The Bedford Incident, On the Beach, Failsafe, very rich literature that helped us in those days imagine how terrible it would be if we ended up in a war with the Soviet Union. It would be an awful outcome for both sides. Then I looked toward the future and thought, we're certainly edging toward, if not in a Cold War with China already. We have a rich basket of disagreements with China about the South China Sea, about intellectual property theft, about fair trade, a lack thereof, as of tariffs on both sides, as in their constant claims of ownership of the South China Sea. I could go on and on. As you can take from that list, China's aspirations, their assertiveness are rising, and their military capability is rising as well. That's a bad combination from the perspective of the United States of America. Think of it as kind of like two streams of activity. One is assertiveness, nationalism, a willingness to push on neighbors and globally. And the other one is military capability. You really don't want those streams to cross. It's like in Ghostbusters, and they're going to cross, our view, somewhere in the 10 to 15 year future. So I went to my publisher, Penguin Press, and said, hey, I've got this idea, kind of want to write a novel. They said, Admiral, you're a great guy, but you've never written a novel. I had written 9 books of nonfiction, many of which have hit bestseller lists, including Amazon's top 10, but I'd never written a novel. So they said, well, Admiral, we've got a wonderful novelist. What would you think about writing a book with Elliot Ackerman? So I'll let Elliot kind of pick up the story from there. He'll talk a little about the characters and how the book opens and about our friendship, which has culminated in this wonderful book. Elliot.
Thanks, Jim. So as the Admiral said, We have a relationship that predates this book by about 10 years. We're both graduates of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts. And when the Admiral left the Navy and became the Dean, he invited me for a semester to serve as the writer in residence. And when he sent me a list of what my duties would entail, one of the bullet points on that list was talk with the Dean about books when he feels like it. So we already had this history of sitting around talking about books and understanding one another's sensibilities. So when our shared editor approached me with this idea of the two of us collaborating on a book, I was very enthusiastic about it and very optimistic that we would have a great working relationship and that our vision for the book would be aligned. And central to that vision was to tell a cautionary tale about what a war with China would look like. But as much as the geopolitics and the technology play important roles, the really central role in this book would be that of its characters, that it would be a character-driven story. And so with that, I thought I would just set the table for the many of you who I assume probably have not read the book. So 2034 opens up in the South China Sea, a body of water that China claims as territorial waters, despite the fact that it is approximately half the size of the continental United States. And today, the US Navy and the navies of our allies conduct what are termed freedom of navigation patrols through the South China Sea to assert the fact that they are in fact international waters. So the book opens on one of these freedom of navigation patrols in the year 2034 on the bridge of the destroyer John Paul Jones, which is the flagship of Commodore Sarah Hunt, a veteran Navy officer, the daughter of a sailor. Her father had served in naval special warfare, where she too had served as a Navy SEAL, but is now finishing out her career in the surface Navy where she began it. And as she's underway with her flotilla, they spy what appears to be a Chinese fishing trawler in distress with smoke coming out of the bridge, billowing up into the air. They go to investigate, but when they investigate, they soon realize that this is anything but an ordinary fishing trawler. So cut to our second principal character, which is Major Chris Wedge Mitchell. Wedge is a fourth generation Marine fighter pilot, and he is piloting his state-of-the-art F-35 strike fighter over the Straits of Hormuz with its wing flirting right up against Iranian airspace. And as he sits in his cockpit on what to him is a very boring mission, he's lamenting the fact that he doesn't really feel much like a pilot at all anymore. Well, because these planes, they just sort of fly themselves. Unlike the aircraft of his father, who flew in Afghanistan and Iraq, his grandfather, who flew dropping snake and napalm in Vietnam, and his great-grandfather, who flew in the South Pacific with the likes of Marine fighter ace Pappy Boyington. So as he's lamenting the fact that this plane just seems to fly itself, his controls become non-responsive, and the plane does, in fact, start flying itself. And it begins flying itself directly into Iranian airspace on a downward path towards the airfield at Bandar Abbas Air Base. Now, cut to the third principal character, which is Sandy Chowdhury. Sandy Chowdhury is a first-generation Indian American who works in the National Security Council staff. He is a PhD graduate from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and the phone begins ringing as he's trying to make sense of this incident in the South China Sea and this budding crisis above the Strait of Hormuz. On the other end of the line is our fourth principal character in the book, the Chinese military attaché to the United States, Admiral Lin Bao. Admiral Lin Bao is a veteran Navy officer of the People's Republic of China. He has a deep knowledge of the United States, having studied in the US at both the Naval War College and Harvard's Kennedy School, but also due to the fact that he is of split parentage. His mother was American, although he was raised in China. So in many respects, his great strength, his understanding of the US, is also an area of suspicion among some of his countrymen. But he is on the other end of the line with Chowdhury to deliver the message that the Chinese have basically had enough of the US putting these freedom of navigation patrols through the South China Sea, and he has been sent there to deliver a message. And what that message is in effect a cyber attack. And at the end of the first chapter, the Chinese basically blink the entire eastern seaboard of the United States, turning the lights off, then immediately turning them back on again. But when they come back on again, all of our systems are not the same. And that is how the first chapter of the book ends. I would only add there's a fifth principal character in the novel, and you meet him in the opening pages of the second chapter. And that is Brigadier General Qasim Farshad. And he is waiting on the tarmac at Bandar Abbas when Wedge's aircraft is taken down. Brigadier General Qasim Farshad is a veteran of the Iranian Quds Force and also a veteran of the forever wars that have gone on for the last 2 decades, although he fought on the opposite side in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria, serving the Iranian government. And he is the namesake, Qasim Farshad, of General Qasim Soleimani, who was a dear friend of his father's, and Qasim Farshad is actually Soleimani's godson. So at this point, the table is set. These are our 5 principal characters that take you into the world of 2034 as this crisis escalates and leads to a global conflagration. So with that, I think we look forward to the discussion. And again, thanks so much for hosting us tonight.
All right. Thank you so much, Elliot, and thank you so much, Admiral, again. And I just, again, I wanted to say, how honored and privileged we are to have the 2 of you here together. I cannot think of a more perfect pair to write a book. Basically, not just great authors, but wonderful veterans of the United States. And you guys have the breadth of experience with regards to war. Elliot, as Maryanne noted, you won the Silver Star near the Second Battle of Fallujah during some of the most intense and extended face-to-face close quarters combat the United States has had in many decades. And at the other end of the spectrum, Admiral, you're a 4-star Admiral, I believe the only Admiral to ever to be Supreme Commander of NATO. You were in command of NATO for covering Afghanistan and later Syria and Libya. So you guys run the gamut of what would be happening at the highest levels of the United States military, but also at the individual level and the characters that you guys develop for the people who are fighting this war. Maybe, Elliot, you could take it from here then and Admiral follow up. As a Marine, I think there was a saying that came out in the first few years of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that America is not at war, the Marine Corps is at war, and America is at the mall. The idea that sadly, roughly 3 million people have served since 9/11, but still less than 1% of the US's population. And that the United States is still detached from these wars, and we're still fighting in Afghanistan, still Americans dying there. Your book obviously presents something completely different. If we went to war with China, it would be an all-engrossing war that would not just affect every American, it would affect the entire world and the geopolitical order. You touched upon it, but is some of that what you hope to get from this book, that Americans maybe should be paying more attention and hopefully cognizant of what our leaders, whether Democrats or Republican, or likewise are doing?
I certainly think so. Among colleagues of mine who are my contemporaries as veterans, sometimes when we're engaging in a bit of black humor, we'll laugh and say, we worry that will be remembered kind of as the equivalent of the veterans of the Boer War, in so much as our war was relatively small. When you imagine the large scale wars like the one that we lay out in 2034, something that concerns me is that over these past 2 decades, as we fought a war that's been sustained through an all-volunteer military and largely funded through deficit spending, is that the result is the American people have been, by and large, anesthetized to war. War is something we don't necessarily feel. So not because Americans are bad people, but we all, we behave according to incentive structures, and when there's no incentive for us to pay attention, we don't pay attention. So when we turn on the news and perhaps we see that the 1st Marine Division might be heading to northern Syria, or X many ships might be redeploying to the South Pacific, most Americans maybe don't pay much attention because it doesn't affect them. I think that sets conditions in our psyche that make it very easy to sleepwalk into a war because we aren't really paying attention until it's too late. And as much as this is a cautionary tale, it's a cautionary tale for a specific type of war, one in which an entire nation just sleepwalks into something that is far more devastating than they ever could have imagined.
Yeah, I'll just add a historical note, particularly since this is World Affairs Council and you know your history well. Let's go back 110 years ago or so, 115 years ago. So now we're at the beginning of the 20th century. Serious scholars were writing books. The subject was why war was impossible, because the dominant powers on the earth were these European nations. They had all the treasure. They had colonies around the world. And their economies were all intertwined, kind of like the US and China's economy is intertwined today. And oh, by the way, the ruling families were intertwined by marriage, by blood, if you will. The Queen Victoria was the aunt of the Kaiser of Germany. So people felt it's kind of impossible that would really get in a war. Well, how'd that turn out? Not well. What occurred was an incident in Sarajevo in 1914 where an extremist assassinated a Grand Duke of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Not only did those nations in Europe go to war, it was the end of the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. Think about that for a minute. You never could have conceived that, even at 1912, 1913. By 1918, these great empires are dust. And you can drop a plumb line from those events to the Great Depression and, of course, the rise of fascism and the Second World War. You know, all in the butcher's bill for those two wars and the devastation that went with it, probably 80 million people died in the 20th century. It was a century drenched in blood. And so the point is, no one in the first decade of the 20th century could have pictured that. Impossible. Humans are wired to think tomorrow is kind of going to be like today, with a little bit of different, but you know, same day, different. And you know, that's not how it always works in history if you look at it. And I'll close by saying, people say to me all the time, well, you know, Admiral, it's, you know, we're not going to go to war with China. I assure you, if you look at history, you can look most recently 100 years ago. Let's go back 2,500 years ago. I'm Greek, so I'm required to throw Greek history into everything. Athens and Sparta. Athens is an established power. Sparta is a rising power. What happens? They collide. They go to war. That's the Peloponnesian Wars. Thucydides wrote that story. Graham Allison, whom I'm sure has spoken for you, coined the term the Thucydides trap. Established power confronted by rising power. US, China. Where do those threat streams come together? About 10 years from now.
All right. And, you know, again, I'm not going to give away too much of the story. I hope you all have a great time, enjoy reading it. And again, everyone who's attending, you're all going to get a signed copy by both Admiral Stavridis and Elliot Ackerman. Just give it maybe about 3 weeks to get signed and sent to you directly in the mail. And if you do want to buy an extra copy, a great gift, or an extra one for yourself, you can buy those on our website. And I think we also have a link to it directly here on the chat feature of the webinar right now. But one thing I'd like to ask the two of you is, you mentioned in different ways, different characters, you know, especially those from you know, outside the United States, with regards to the American perspective, say by the time we get to 2034, or possibly even now. You know, there were a lot of people who said after 9/11, it was not a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. You have the Chinese highest levels of military leadership in China say something similar in 2034. You also have a great character, probably one of my favorites in the book, the Indian Admiral, who says that basically American hubris has finally gotten the better of its greatness. You know, I think a great line. Are you both concerned about the United States, not just in terms of our hubris, but our complacency? We talked about it a little bit, you know, a moment before.
Sure, I'll take it and then hand it over to the Admiral. I certainly am, and I think one of the themes that exists in this book is the type of complacency that can exist around technology. and the assumption that our technology insulates us from all military threats. And without giving anything away, I already mentioned there's a cyber attack at the beginning of this book, and we see how that cyber attack challenges the idea of American military supremacy abroad. So, so I think that there is a type of complacency that we as Americans are subject to. You already wrote and mentioned one part, which is our all-volunteer military and the way we fought our wars by being largely insulated from them, I think makes us potentially subject to a type of complacency in believing that, well, wars are things that don't affect most Americans. And another one is our unwavering belief in our technological primacy is something that makes us subject to a type of technological complacency, which could also, I believe, get us in a lot of trouble. So the book is certainly a wake-up call. I would only add the caveat that this is the novelist as opposed to the policy wonk in me speaking, that our job with these characters is to write them in such a way when they step onto the page, they're making their case to the reader as though they're making their case before God. So it's not as though I agree with every single thing that these characters who are adversarial to the United States are saying, but I'm imagining what someone who is adversarial to the United States, we're imagining how that person would view us and view our weaknesses.
Yeah, let me add a thought, which is some have said, oh, well, have you written a novel about American decline? I hope that's not our future. One interesting point to be made is you don't see a lot of allies, partners, friends around the United States here. This is a conflict between US and China. In fact, China has stronger, more obvious allies than the United States. I hope that's not our future. And we need to work very hard to make sure it isn't. And again, this is a cautionary tale about a number of things. One is sleepwalking into a war. One is lack of imagination in thinking through what it could look like. One is the importance of allies, partners, and friends. Another is the need for better cyber security. There's a lot of caution in this cautionary tale. I do want to say, I am not, if you ask me to be predictive as opposed to cautionary, I am not a declinist. I think the United States has its best days ahead of it. And I'm not a triumphalist. I don't think the United States has to run the world or be the world's policeman or solve every problem. But I do believe we've got an incredible hand of cards. We have a vast nation physically. Its geography is profoundly good. We're guarded left and right by vast oceans. We have benign neighbors to the north and south. There's no serious threat in this hemisphere. We have a young population. People want to emigrate here. You know, we got to control our borders, got it, check. But people want to come here. That's a huge net plus as the world population stabilizes, and in many places, China, Europe begins to significantly decline. Youth will help us as this century unspools. Our universities remain the envy of the world. Our Silicon Valley still first rate. Our medical equivalent, bio equivalent of that, the Route 128 tech belt. You know, I could go on and on. You get the idea. We're a vibrant democracy. What I worry about, really the only significant thing I worry about, is the polarization in our politics. That concerns me deeply. And I'll close by saying the president of the United States in the novel in the year 2034 is a woman. That's unremarkable. I'm frankly surprised we haven't already had a woman president. We're going to get one over the next 10 years, I'm sure. But she is neither a Republican nor a Democrat. My two millennial daughters just look at both political parties and shake their heads. We need to start thinking about how we're going to kind of get over the polarization. If we don't, that's the path to what we talk about in the novel.
And maybe just moving on to the characters, maybe I'll first a question for you, Elliot, and then a related question to that, Admiral, after that. I'm just curious, Elliot, I've read a lot of your excellent novels. I highly recommend them to anyone. But was there a challenge in writing a an array of characters from such a big variety of backgrounds and cultures. You know, you have characters from US, China, Iran, India, and Russia. And then related to that, Admiral, because obviously you've been there yourself at the highest levels of power and seen how decisions have to be made and made the decisions yourself. Is part of what you guys hope people take from this book is that despite the incredible role of technology in modern warfare, at the end of the day, a lot of the most important decisions in warfare and how war progresses are still made at a human and individual level?
Sure, I'll go just first vis-a-vis the question specific to the characters. I did not find this to be more challenging. I found it to be lots of fun. We had lots of fun creating these characters, and I think it's it's why I enjoy doing what I do. Is when I'm sitting there and the characters start surprising me. They start doing and behaving in ways where they really have a life of their own, and they behave like real people. You know, before I started writing books, I would maybe hear authors say that, and I would kind of roll my eyes a little bit when they refer to sort of the magic of writing. But I mean, they really do. They start doing things and behaving with a logic that very much seems to be all their own. So that's always something that's joyful to me. And I guess it's just my life philosophy. I believe, the differences we have as human beings are infinitesimal when compared to the similarities that we have. And I think finding the points of access for all of these characters, a character like Qasem Farshad, who, yes, maybe superficially you could say is as antithetical to my own character as possible. I mean, he fought on the opposite side of a war as I did. No, I find a million access points to a character like Qasem Farshad or Sandy Chowdhury or Admiral Sarah Hunt, as I'm sure Jim does. So that was our great joy, I think. And then the last point I would say is, I think just the spirit of the book with technology is, yes, I think we were trying to I would draw attention to certain areas where it seems as though the U.S. has some blind spots. But I'll let the Admiral expand on that a bit more.
I would say that in the course of working in Washington, 6 tours in the Pentagon, 1 at State Department, 1 at the National Security Council staff. I think I know DC, I know the interagency pretty well. And I've seen again and again and again how big doors, big decisions, life-changing, as in the life of nations changing decisions, big doors swing on small hinges. And the small hinges are the human beings and their impact. And a staffer at the NSC or a second-tier diplomat at State or a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. These are bright, switched on, hardworking individuals who are serving their country as surely as Wedge is flying his Hornet around, although at less personal physical risk. And let me tell you, they put their heart and soul into the job they're doing to defend the country in their way in Washington. And again and again, I've seen very big decisions turn on something that one character does. And so as I look at the cast of characters in the novel, it's actually a very small cast. I mean, think about Winds of War and War and Remembrance, which is 1,200 pages of turgid prose describing World War II. And it's a great read by Herman Wouk. I have a signed first edition of War and Remembrance here. But that's not what we tried to write. This is not War and Peace, where you literally need a 5-page index so you can figure out who everybody is in the novel. This one is pretty easy to follow. And it's because the characters are unique. I think they're very real, very three-dimensional, and they're compelling. And so for me, the most compelling character in the novel may or may not surprise you. It's not Sarah Hunt, although there's a lot of my own life experience as a ship captain, a Commodore, as a strike group commander on the Enterprise. But at the end of the day, the character I find most compelling is the Chinese naval officer, Lin Bao, who at the start of the novel is trapped behind a desk in Washington, carpooling into the embassy. I've been there. I've been that captain. And all you want to do, just like Lin Bao does, is get back to sea, be on the bridge of a ship again, do something that matters for your country operationally. And then Lin Biao, at the end of his career, wants to be an educator. He wants to teach and try and unwind the violence that stalks both of these nations. He's a pretty compelling character. And as Elliot said, his mother's American, father is Chinese. He's not exactly a man without a country. He's kind of a man with two countries. And I think we caught him pretty well. So point being, it's the people that matter. I've seen it again and again and again. It's really not the technology. Much of the technology in this book happens off stage. It's about the people.
And the book, again, without giving away any of the highlights, it is a great progression. It's really an action thriller and something so different to what I'm used to from each of you as authors. It's kind of fun to see you guys completely changing styles. But the concept of miscalculation or someone misinterpreting something leading to much more catastrophic decisions or influences is there throughout the book. You have leaders of both sorts in the book. I'm just curious, in the years to come, are you perhaps more concerned about a senior military leader or senior civilian leader, perhaps having undue influence upon the president or convincing the president to do something wrong and maybe lead us into something like an escalation with China?
I'll grab that one because I'm not worried about either of those. I think that our senior leaders get this. I know them all. I know our current civilian team extremely well. Everybody there was in the same job, one level lower. Vice President Biden is now the president. Deputy Secretary of State Tony Blinken is now the Secretary of State. My good friend Avril Haines, who was deputy at CIA, is now the Director of National Intelligence. This is a deeply experienced team. They're very collegial. They're very smart. They're not China focused to the point of not looking at anything else. I mean, Lloyd Austin, who is a contemporary, a general, I think he's a year older than I am, from West Point. Lloyd is now the Secretary of Defense, and he's like Mr. Middle East, but he knows China's kind of looming out there. So I'm not worried about the senior civilians, and I'm really not worried about the senior military, all of whom were 2-star generals and admirals when I was a 4-star. I know all of them very well. It's a very good group. Here's what I'm worried about. I'm worried about the junior officers out at sea, in those dusty streets, in those jets, in those cockpits, flying, driving ships. They want to perform for their country. They're in their 20s and 30s. They are very young by my standards, certainly. And they are dedicated, and they're also inexperienced in understanding the context of their ship, their aircraft, their patrol in this larger geopolitical world. So it's that miscalculation that I'm worried about. Again, back to World War I, this is one young extremist who shoots up the Archduke and has no clue about the geopolitics of what's going on. He just wants his nation to achieve liberty and strike a blow against tyranny. But what he did was strike the match that killed 80 million people. Think about that for a minute. That's where I would focus my worries. And that's where, at least on the US side, I think we ought to be focusing a lot of attention to make sure we don't have that kind of miscalculation.
And maybe just a quick follow-up to that, Admiral. I think, and you guys pointed out in the book as well, as compared to, say, the Chinese military structure, that lower level officers are given a degree of flexibility and also just the ability to make decisions for themselves. I know, for instance, when we hosted General McChrystal, when he reformed JSOC, a lot of it was the idea to let combat level officers and leaders make the decisions on the ground for what they see. So how do you balance that with the need for perhaps an officer at that level, the combat level, not causing a mistake that escalates too far?
Yeah, you're talking about two very different things here. What Stan McChrystal did very effectively, and Stan worked for me for over a year in Afghanistan as my principal in-theater commander. Nobody finer than Stan McChrystal. What you're describing correctly is that in the staffing process that involves figuring out where a terrorist like al-Zarqawi is moving and connecting nodes and refining intelligence and using cyber and using social networks and building the team that will ultimately go and put a red dot on his forehead. That's what Stan reformed. What I'm talking about is the team that goes out into the field, the 27-year-old SEAL who has all the weapons and is out there in the field. It's one thing when they're hunting Zarqawi in the ruins of Baghdad. It's a different thing when that young Navy lieutenant is in his Hornet flying and is challenged by a Chinese J-22. Here are two 20-somethings flying $200 million in lethal hardware in what becomes a very small space. That's not what Stan McChrystal was addressing. And the way you address this part of it over here is by training, by seminars, by exercises, by simulations, by putting that young pilot in the Hornet, in a simulator, and having a Chinese J-22 fly straight at her. And when the first time she unloads 7 missiles on it, maybe the second time she learns, I'm going to do a break, I'm going to do something different. It's that point of the spear incident that I'm talking about. That has to be addressed through individual training of these extraordinary young men and women who stand on that wall for us.
And just lastly on that topic, Elliot, maybe just from your own experience, obviously after you got out of the Marine Corps, you spent many years as a journalist, as a writer based in the Middle East, living many years there in Istanbul and going throughout the region. But before you were deployed as a young lieutenant, you came to lead a platoon in Fallujah and elsewhere, incredibly admirably. Do you feel you were adequately prepared for the context you were being sent into, for an understanding of the culture and who your enemy was and how they fight?
Absolutely. I felt completely prepared. I mean, by the time I stepped in front of my rifle platoon, I was 24 years old when I stepped in front of my rifle platoon. And I guess depending on when you start counting, I'd been preparing for that moment in earnest probably since I was 17 or 18 years old. So, 6, 7 years. I felt very prepared. I would just echo the Admiral's point that I saw, numerous times as one of those junior officers in harm's way, that very big events would hinge on the decisions you would make as a lieutenant or a captain, or even your subordinates, the staff sergeant or gunnery sergeant who was right there on scene and had to kind of call the ball. And so it requires obviously training people very, very well, but ultimately, you're going to be forced to trust the decision-making of those people. And my experience was probably 97, 98% of the time, the decision was made correctly. And then the other percent of the time, that's war and the fog of war. And, we have to deal with the ramifications when the wrong decision is made. Something we try to get at in the book, the human element in warfare.
Yeah, can I give an example from my own past? This may surprise you, but I did not enter the world fully formed as a 4-star admiral. One time I looked a lot like Elliot did when he was 24. When I was 26, I was the tactical action officer in command of the missile batteries on an Aegis ship sailing through the Strait of Hormuz. Saw contact coming straight at me. Flip switches, brought missiles to bear, lit off fire control radar. Fortunately for me, my commanding officer reached over my shoulder and put a stop to what Lieutenant J.G. Stavridis was about to do, which was shoot down this incoming aircraft, which was not hostile, was not a threat, had come from the Iranian coast. A year after that, USS Vincennes, that junior officer, I won't say his name, but is a rough contemporary of mine, flipped the switches, turned on the fire control radar, and put a missile right through an Iranian civilian commercial aircraft, killed over 150 Iranians, a lot of women and children. It happens, and it's real, and it's the young person at the point of the spear who perhaps at a moment of real decision doesn't have a commanding officer to reach and save him the way I was saved. And in particular, you know, aircraft flying high speed, boy, I worry about that a lot.
Thank you both. Great to hear two very different perspectives that I think for the most part give a large degree of confidence, but obviously just a need to be concerned about, you know, hopefully something there not escalating. Just one more question.
I do have another comment, by the way.
Sure.
When Elliot was that 25-year-old, he was eating really crummy food out of cardboard little, what do you call those things? M-wraps or something?
Nice.
Yeah, MREs, right. Whereas Lieutenant J.G. Stavridis, when I got off watch, I'd go to the wardroom, you know, there'd be tablecloths, there'd be ice cream. It was a bad night if we didn't get chocolate sauce at the end of the meal.
I'm surprised to know that we're a pretty resourceful bunch, so we often didn't have to eat the MREs. We would get other stuff.
I bet. Anyway.
And for any of the students watching, the Admiral was not paid for that Navy recruitment endorsement. And lastly, just before I turn to the audience questions, you know, you both you closed the book with a great quote from Abraham Lincoln that would probably surprise people. It surprised me when I read it that it was written 20 years before the outbreak of the Civil War. If not be our lot, we ourselves must be destruction be our lot. We ourselves must be its author and finisher. This idea that America, if it is to fall, would fall from within, not from challenge from without. And you also know, you know, you say the sacrifice of the idea of America was perhaps the greatest loss of what came out of this war that took place. I suppose, how concerned are you about that overall grander concept of the American ideal and American kind of cohesiveness and just of our need to kind of maintain a common vision and a common sense of togetherness?
I would just, I believe very much that that we have to have a common sense of what this country is and believe in a common ideal, even if some of us believe we're reaching the ideal and others of us don't believe we're reaching it. That's essential. You know, an ideal is just a marker on the wall, right? It's neither true nor false. It's something you're continually striving for. So again, you know, this country was founded to make a more perfect union. That means it is a country that is perpetually in motion, perpetually evolving, never stagnant nor still. But the second we decide that we're just not going to make that more perfect union, or it was never worth making in the first place, and it wasn't even worth striving, then we have real problems. I don't think that we're there yet, but I think having a common language about the American ideal, having a common language about the enterprise we're in, the striving we're in, and the fact that we're disagreeing about the ways we strive towards that ideal is important. You know, it's important to understand the rules of the game you're in. And I think sometimes we're just not even conscious of this. Sometimes we're not even conscious of the ways America is unique, and America is unique. If you look around the world, and many of the countries mentioned in these books, these are blood and soil countries. Blood and soil meaning they're defined by their borders and the nationality or ethnicity of the people who live within them. You know, specifically, I could move to China tomorrow. I could immigrate to China, and as long as I lived in China, I would never be Chinese. A person who is born in China can come to this country, live here. The second they get their citizenship, they are an American. And that makes this, it makes this country unique. And we can criticize this country, have critiques for this country, but I think it's important that we recognize that and don't lose sight of that in the kind of maelstrom, which has been the last few years in American life.
Yeah, that's well said. And I'll add a practical coda to it, which is that I spent almost 8 years as a combatant commander. That just means you're the military owner and operator of all Department of Defense forces in a region, right? So I did 3 years at Southcom. Latin America and the Caribbean, about 40 countries down there. And then I did Europe with, Europe and the Levant, say about 60 countries or so, about 100 countries. So I'd go to all those countries. That was my job. And in every country, I'd go to the embassy and pay my respects to the ambassador of the United States of America. Here's a news flash. Every embassy I went to, there was a line of people trying to get visas, trying to come to America. You think you see that at Chinese embassies? Think you see that at Russian embassies? Newsflash, you do not. People want to come here. And do we have to control our southern border? Check. As I said, got it. But boy, is that a comparative advantage for this country, that people want to come here. And why do they want to come here? It's the American dream, all the things we talked about, our value set and all that. But it's really what Elliot said. It's that they know they can come here and they can become an American. You don't get that privilege pretty much anywhere else, frankly.
Just
All right. Sure.
to the Admiral's Coda. When I served in Iraq and Afghanistan, some of the most American people I met weren't Americans. They were the interpreters and many of the indigenous troops I fought alongside. And these were people who were risking their lives because they either wanted to come to America or they wanted to see their country. They had a vision of their country that was somewhat aligned with some of the ideas that America aspires to. And so to see people risking themselves and going into harm's way for those ideas, it makes them Americans. And so sort of in the book, I think one of the things we get at is sort of, what is the nature of our country when it's held in conflict with another country? And I think it's very important to never lose sight of the fact that there are aspects of our country that are unique. And I say that with no jingoism, just factually, they are unique.
All right. And I might just, for the sake of time, combine a few people's questions, especially if they're kind of a related topic. And don't feel you both need to answer it if you think the other one's covered it. I'll try to get to as many audience questions as possible. And Paul asked, will the Chinese read and study this book with regards to our military possibilities? A fun question. And then Rita asks, Sally asked, what about a war without firing a bullet? Like China blocks all supply chains to the United States, say, especially for manufactured goods.
Well, I was asked the other day, if you could force one person on the planet Earth to read the book, who would it be? And my answer was President Xi. And first, because if we could just get like a snapshot of him holding the book, would immediately sell 500 million copies in China for sure. But in seriousness, I hope the Chinese read it and study it because A, it's a cautionary tale. B, it would help them understand some aspects of the American psyche that I think are important and might help in some way prevent us from stumbling into a war with each other. Elliot,
Okay.
you want to take the second half of that, or I think we're good.
Okay.
I'm sorry. The question about could we fight a war without firing a shot?
Or would the Chinese maybe start a war without firing a shot by cutting off supply chains?
I think the idea of a war without firing a shot is the right verbiage. I would say trade and tariffs, you are firing shots. People see them coming. They retaliate. It's easy to attribute. The war you fight without a visible shot is cyber and cyber security. And we are vulnerable there. China is gaining rapidly. I'd say roughly a peer with us, maybe a year behind us in certain things. We have a lot of work to do if we want to maintain our edge there. Good question.
Okay. And then kind of a corollary to that, Nancy asks, what are each of your experiences with regards to China? And then, sorry, I just lost the questions. Sometimes it's hard to keep them all organized. Rita asks, what can China and the US do to avoid a disaster?
China, my experience is half my career was spent in the Pacific. I've been to China on many, many, many occasions. I know very senior Chinese officials. I don't want to name them so they can, but as the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, we have many, many very senior Chinese diplomats who are graduates. I'm content with the accuracy of the book in that regard.
And just on the broader theme of what would you each hope the U.S. and China could do to avoid a disaster?
Go ahead, Elliot, and then
I would say that, you know, this book was written with the spirit of trying to avoid that disaster, to begin conversations of mutual recognition of how horrible that war would be, in much the same way that we had deterrent regimes with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, and there was a consensus that a war between the U.S. and the Soviet Union would have been in nobody's best interest. So I think imagining that and doing the intellectual work to get there in a deliberate way is something that could help avoid a war.
I would say we need a plan. We need a strategy. I credit the Trump administration for correctly seeing that China is a looming tower that is going to challenge the United States and ultimately could result in the events described in 2034. I give them credit for that. Where they failed was to then create a plan, have a strategy. They were very episodic, very tactical. 1 minute, President Xi is in Mar-a-Lago. He's the new BFF of President Trump. They're having a boozy dinner. Well, the President Trump doesn't drink, but boozy, I assume, on the part of President Xi at Mar-a-Lago. Great, I guess. But then like 3 months later, we're slapping 40% tariffs on tons of Chinese goods. Then pandemic comes and it's all those terrible comments about China. It just doesn't make any sense. What we need is a plan. We need a strategy that says, yes, China is a concern, a serious one. That means we need, as Elliot just said, to imagine what the war could look like, what the escalation would look like. How do we control that ladder of escalation? We need to have a strong military so we can deter China. Part of the reason China wouldn't attempt to attack U.S. ships in the South China Sea is because they would feel they would lose a military confrontation. We need to be vastly better in cyber, as I've said numerous times tonight. We need trade and tariff policies that confront China, where they are wanting in terms of allowing U.S. corporations into China, but they still want access to U.S. markets. We need an economic strategy that deals with that. We need a cultural strategy that talks about what's our narrative? How do we talk about ourselves? Self-talk matters. And that includes what Hollywood does, how Hollywood either bends the knee to China or stands up and publishes books like 2034. I'm not sure if 2034 were a movie property. Many in Hollywood might be afraid because they're afraid of losing the Chinese market somehow. We need a strategy that comes across all of those zones and fits together: diplomacy, economics, military, cyber, culture, business. Thread it together, put it in front of experts, ask Henry Kissinger to lead an effort to knit it all together, and then execute it methodically, undramatically. The greatest book of leadership ever written is The Godfather by Mario Puzo. And in that book, the Don says, don't make the mistake of hating your enemies. It clouds your judgment. Let's bring some judgment to the table. Let's create a strategic plan. That's the best way to avoid the outcomes described in 2034.
It's the last question from the audience. We spoke earlier about both of your concerns, especially, Admiral, you spoke about that a junior officer perhaps being in a situation they're not prepared for and making a decision that could go catastrophically wrong. Paul asks, former Prime Minister Kevin Rudd recently raised a similar concern about Beijing, giving regional military commanders more autonomy and the dangers of this leading to escalation. What are your comments?
I know Kevin Rudd well. I count him a friend. He is quite extraordinary in his breadth of understanding of China. He speaks flawless Mandarin. In addition to being the former prime minister, he's now the head of an institute. When he says something about China, listen, and he is entirely accurate. And what he is describing is a general rise in nationalism and militarism within China and its culture. Yes, regional commanders are getting more control. I'll tell you what got my attention. President Xi showing up in a uniform at a recent celebratory parade with, you know, the usual endless missiles and troops going by. Can you picture Joe Biden deciding he's just going to put on a Navy uniform or a Marine Corps uniform? And that would be a pretty incredible statement. It kind of unsettled me. It also throws back to who's the last Chinese leader who wore a uniform all the time? Mao Zedong. And Xi is consciously reaching for that title of the second Mao. So that ought to concern us at the highest levels, along with the commander level that Paul asked about, down to the tactical level. We've got our challenges, so does China.
All right, and a lot of great questions. Thank you to all the audience. And again, you'll all receive a copy of the book, and invite you to buy extra copies if you want through our website or the link that's on the chat feature of this webinar right now. Lastly, would each of you maybe like to make a last comment? We've talked a lot about kind of what we hope for the United States, but what this book reflects and what you hope people take away and where we as a nation go from here.
I hope people take away from this book the fact that the world we live in is a pretty great place, and let's make sure we've got both hands on the steering wheel so that we can keep it a great place for the next generation.
Yeah, I'll just give a practical point to that. I hope when people finish the book, they put it down, they look out the window, and it's a nice spring day out there, and they see a young woman walking her dog after work, and they think, like Elliot just said, this is a pretty sweet life and world we've got for all the challenges, all the problems. Let's make sure we keep it that way. Cautionary tale. We can do this, people. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And just lastly, just a last reminder for our audience, if you want to join us for one of our bigger events here at the end of April, we're delighted to host the president of the World Economic Forum. That's the group that puts on the Davos Summit, putting all those billionaires and prime ministers and presidents together. So we're delighted to have that on April 28th. And lastly, just to both of you, I want to thank you so much for joining us again. We've hosted you each multiple times now at this stage. I want to thank you earnestly. I know a lot of people say it, both of you, for your service to the nation for many, many years. And equally, I think for your service to the nation after you both left the military. I think you're both helping the American public and beyond have a better and broader understanding of what's going on in the world, and also, what America's place can and should be in it. So thank you both very much.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Thank you.